Hi, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Muna Khan. I'm a lecturer at CEJ, and I'm delighted today that we have Amantha Perera with us, who's joining us from Melbourne. Amantha is a journalist and now researcher with CQ University in Melbourne. He has, in his journalism career, he has worked on conflict, crime, justice, the environment, and the military, and I'm just naming a few beats. His work has appeared in Reuters, Washington Post, Times, Sydney Morning Herald, Guardian, and that again is just a few publications. He is the Asia Pacific coordinator for the DART Center, which is run by Columbia University School of Journalism. And as I said, he's researching at CQ University, where he was based and began work on online trauma amongst journalists in the Philippines when the COVID outbreak occurred. Thank you so much for joining us, Amantha. I'm really excited to talk to you.
My pleasure.
So you've been doing a lot of research. I wanted to start by asking how journalists are faring during this time across the region.
Well, I think as of now, we are past the acute stage. When towards mid-March, early April, when the lockdowns became almost universal and every country, everywhere, we saw severe restrictions coming into place and coming into place without many people anticipating it. Journalists were forced to work from home. There was no planning, pre-planning. The situation was overwhelming, unprecedented, and there was so much chaos at that point. And I think we are now past that acute stage, and it has now we are in a situation where most of us understand that this is a situation that is not going to go away soon, that this is a long-term situation, that we need to make changes that are long-term, and the likely repercussions are also likely to be felt in the long term. In terms of how journalists have reacted, initially I think it was overwhelming, unprecedented. Journalists didn't know how to react to this. And there was also a lot of fear, anxiety, because this situation, I don't think anybody had faced it ever before, where there was no safe place. There was no place that we could call safe. And because of that, anywhere and everywhere you worked, you lived, was a possible threat location. Now, I think as people have gotten used to or have tried to come to terms with these new threat levels and the dangers, the most significant and the most prominent danger or fear that the journalists are now facing is one of financial anxiety. We are hearing this across the board everywhere, that lots of journalists are not sure whether they would have a job, and if at all, and even if they have a job, whether it would be paying them enough. And that anxiety is right now at the topmost. And along with that, there are also other issues like what is the physical danger? Has the physical danger gone away? Or are we all in a sort of a holding pattern where anything can break out without very little notice?
You've done a lot of research on what trauma is like amongst journalists. And here in Pakistan, I have been speaking to some reporters about their work in the field. And you spoke, they're certainly feeling a lot of anxiety because they're out reporting in the field. They don't know who could be infecting them. They fear infection in the field. Then they fear coming home and spreading that infection. It's a new kind of anxiety. It's a new kind of trauma. But journalists in this part of the world, and of course, anywhere who cover conflict, have had to deal with trauma. Do you think pre-COVID, journalists in this part of the region had understood the impact of trauma? What has your research shown you?
Well, I think journalists were understanding the concept of trauma and the concept of trauma within their work. It's been a dialogue that has been evolving for the last probably 3 decades. But let's say Asia, the part of the world that where we come from, it has been a little bit slow to take off because the culture that we come from, mental well-being, was not something that was discussed openly, say a generation back from ours. It was not something that was discussed openly. And the same reflection was there in journalism circles as well. But in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, we've seen a lot of focus and attention on the trauma impact, especially trauma impact of conflict, ongoing conflict, and also conflict where the journalist is not an outsider, but also part of that community, which is the case in most parts of South Asia, where we have journalists who are covering conflict within a community, within a society that they're part of. So there's been a lot of discussion, and there's also been similar discussions taking place in terms of covering natural disasters, other areas like child abuse. So it's been an evolving dialogue. But I think with the COVID pandemic, uh, the trauma impact was mainly manifest in what we now term the online trauma impact. Because as journalists were forced to work from home, the screen that is in front of us became the interface for gathering information, connecting with sources, and also disseminating their works of journalism. And that platform was also the main platform where trauma threats were manifesting. Now, the idea of online or digital trauma threats is quite new, and we are only beginning to understand the impact, the manifestation, and also how we can mitigate these threats. So I think what COVID has done is to bring this idea of online trauma threats right into the center of focus within journalism circles, and outside of it in general as well. So right now, on something that we've been like looking at peripherally, it's right now the main focus.
So in Mongo Bay, you wrote a piece in which you talked exactly about this, about journalists who are on the front line and they are reporting, and the screen in front of them is also part of that front line. And you said it's the first universal social media dependent emergency of this generation. So the screen is in a way your best friend, but also a source of a lot of fake news. Uh, what advice do you have for journalists who are so dependent on the screen for their
Well,
work and their information?
yeah, I think there's been a lot of attention on the negative aspects of what can happen through a digital interface.
Mhm.
Fake news, online trauma threats, graphic content, uh, screen addiction, all that kind of stuff. But we also should understand that just as this is a source of danger, it's also, or it can also work as a pocket first aid kit,
Mm.
where you can use the screen also to do your work properly, and also to make sure that you maintain your mental well-being and self-care. Like, for example, one of the key things that has come about right now is where we work in terms of carrying out our works of journalism. Now, if we tend to drag the computer into a darkened corner of the house or a room and just keep staring at that, that invariably creates this sense of being locked in, of the whole environment caving down on you. And with a lot of journalists that I have spoken to and I keep engaging, one of the key things that we tell them is that try to work in places where they are brightly lit, where you have lots of open space, and try to move where you work as much as possible, and also make sure that you initiate breaks from the screen. Now, this doesn't happen naturally. This doesn't happen organically, especially if you are a journalist, because it's a fast moving story, it's an important story, and you need to be on top of your information. So because of that, you are obviously glued to the only source that connects you to the outside world. But we need to make sure that we take breaks. It could be breaks in terms of small breaks while doing the work, or like some of us have initiated as less screen time as possible during weekends, spending time with family, just doing mundane things, things that relaxes you. So you have to make sure that you somehow or the other gain some control of this situation. And I think, like I said earlier, uh, in the acute state of the pandemic, that was a little bit difficult. But now that we understand the situation a little bit better, and also the restrictions have eased a little bit, we can gain control of our situation and try to, you know, have some control of your work. I'll give one example. I was speaking to a colleague from a South Asian country who has been dealing a lot with migrant workers stuck in the Middle East. Now, suddenly, in the middle of the night, this person got a call from a worker who was stuck somewhere in the Middle East. And when she hung up, it just overwhelmed her. She couldn't go back to sleep. Uh, Weeks of work just caved in on her. And when I spoke to her, what I realized was that the trigger was where she took the call. She took the call in a darkened room without thinking what was going to happen. And it just triggered a whole avalanche of negative impacts. So now what we've done is that we've tried to kind of have a plan that you won't take calls anywhere or everywhere. You have a certain time of day where you take these calls, where you kind of make it much more kind of work oriented. Take notes, keep the notes, and also have a time frame within which you don't take these calls. That like there is a start stop button to your work, and I think that's important that we create this sense of control, because what happens is when we are working in home, all the outward appearances of controlling work are out. You don't sign in, you don't sign out, you don't take transport, you don't even dress up. You're just working in your pajamas. And that invariably, what it does is that the difference between your personal and your professional lives just merge, and you can't make that distinction. And we need to make that distinction. We need to make sure that we are in control of what we do, where we do it, and how we do it.
Amantha, here in Pakistan, there have been across the board a lot of job losses. Media companies have let go of people. Those of journalists working from home are worried that once the pandemic eases, they may be forced to continue to work from home as a cost-cutting measure. Then there is the issue of freelancers who are struggling to get work in these times. What are you seeing this in other parts of the world in your research? And you spoke of it a little bit earlier. How can you ease the anxiety, which is very real, about a person's future employment?
Uh, yes, we are seeing this across the board. There is no distinction where you're from, what you do, or the platforms that you work on. Everywhere we are seeing this anxiety of job loss and income loss. The key thing in trying to at least manage this anxiety is to understand that the situation is not going to be easy, and assess that situation as best as you can, and also as much as possible talk about the situation within your community, because sometimes it's better to raise these concerns as a community within an organization or even wider than that, rather than raising them individually. And I think then is the next step would be to look at this in a positive way, in whatever way possible. I mean, let's say in terms of this financial anxiety that we are facing globally, uh, it's something that journalists need to start talking more and try to figure out how best to face up to this, because this is not going to go away soon. This is not like a lockdown where your only source of connection to the outside world is going to be your internet connection. That will only be there for 2 3 months, and it will ease. This is not going to be like that. Once these lockdowns are eased, we will be stepping out to a different kind of a world, and we would have to be far more adaptive to make sure that not only can we are we in a position to do our work effectively, but also to make sure that we get paid for that work.
Have you had an opportunity to consider what, once the pandemic eases and the lockdowns ease, what impact COVID will have on journalism and the news media industry?
Uh, in terms of like my work, I think what it has really done is that it has brought focus squarely onto online trauma threats. Barely 6 months ago, when I started my research, with every journalist, except for a very few, I had to do a 10-15 minute introduction and explain what online trauma threats were, how they manifest, what kind of impact we suspect they were having. And then journalists understood that. But what COVID had done is that just brought that whole concept of online trauma, online threats into the center of focus. And I think that's not going to go away. I think there's a lot of attention uh, within individual journalists as well as within the community to face up to these threats, to understand these threats, also to develop skills among journalists to face up to these threats. I think the other immediate changeover would be, like you said, is a lot of officers, a lot of organizations will cut down the number of people working from within their premises. Now, how do you adjust to that? What kind of changes will that entail in practically? But I also uh, think, and this has come through my discussion with a lot of journalists, is that the value for authentic information, professional journalism, has also gone up. Because what the pandemic showed was that this information could be life saving. And just as information is life saving, lies, fake news could be life threatening. And there was a time that people just sought and searched for authentic information. And the value that has been placed on authentic information and professional journalism has gone up. Now, what we need to be adaptive is how do we deliver information in a way that we regain the trust of our audiences? And also, how do we do that in a way that it will support quality journalism? Because quality journalism doesn't come cheap. You pay peanuts, you get monkeys. So we need to convince our audiences that gathering information, gathering authentic, valuable, and timely information is costly. It's not an easy operation. And the efficient professionals who are doing this need to be compensated for what they're doing. During this pandemic, the discussions happened organically. Very rarely did we see outside journalism organizations and journalism organizations that probably did not relate culturally to what was going on in some parts of South Asia, coming in and superimposing some of these concepts. The discussion started from within the community. And that's a good thing, that journalists understand the complex nature of the work that we do, and that the complex adaptive measures that we need to take as well.
And thank you once again for joining us. It was your time today was really valuable for all of us. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure.